Okay. Hello everyone. This is Garrett Hess. I'm going to be showing you what the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 was. So what was the Satsuma Rebellion? Is that the Satsuma Rebellion was fueled mostly by outrage and dissatisfaction made by sweeping changes and reforms in Japan during the late 1800s. These sweeping changes and reforms would later be known as the Meiji Restoration. We all know what it was, so I shouldn't have to go into an explanation about it. So, a big part of life before the Meiji Restoration was social classes, and these could basically define someone's life. And this, in the order of highest to lowest, there was the aristocracy, so which was like the emperor, judiciary officials, like think of like the Supreme Court, and high-ranking samurai. And in modern terms, they would be like majors and generals. And we have the samurai, farming peasants, artisans, merchants, and the untouchables. We'll get back to them in a minute. Now, the reason why the farming peasants aren't at the bottom is because of how Japan was at the time. They were a very isolationist and um, self-sufficient country. So they really relied on the peasants to make the food. And that's why they're above artisans and merchants, because artisans would at least make art and sculptures and all of that, and they'd like contribute to the culture. While merchants, they just sell stuff that artisans or farming peasants got. So they didn't contribute as much to society as the other classes. And now the untouchables are at the bottom because they are ethnic minorities and people who had jobs dealing with death. And the ethnic minorities um would be normally excluded from life. And what I mean by jobs dealing with death is executioners, slaughterhouse workers, and anything that had to do with killing or dealing with dead people. Now, the Meiji Restoration had a pretty big impact on the military. Um, the biggest part of it was dissolving the shogunate, which was military directors. I already went over them with like commanders, generals, sergeants, all of that. And they replaced it with a modernized imperial military. And it was modeled after European nations that recently modernized. And it was, I don't know how to really say it. The Imperial Army was basically an army of conscripts, and it was kind of screwed up in a way because it was any able-bodied man from 17 years old to 40 had to complete at least 7 years in the army, and and it would be like you'd be actually in the army, and then for like 4 years or something like that, and you'd have like a year of National Guard, and then 2 years of being in um in reserve. And I probably messed that up, but it my point still stands about how it worked. And it was also really crazy how rich people how rich people worked too. They were able to buy their way out of conscription, and it was basically you didn't have any uber rich people in the. Excuse me for a second. So you didn't really have any uber rich people in the military because they just bought their way out. And that helped the economy because you had more money flowing in. And there was a big difference in terms of weaponry between the samurai and the imperial soldiers. And you would think that on paper, the samurai would absolutely smash the Imperial Army because they had so much more experience. The Imperial Army was just full of just full of peasants who were working on their parents' farm, getting like rice, you know. And the samurai were these big, experienced soldiers who've been working their entire life for their position in the military and had it stripped because of these big reforms. And the um and the Imperial Army in reality had a huge advantage um because of the firepower they had. And the rifles, like the ones shown, those were the ones used in the rebellion, and they were normally single shot rifles with black powder. So by single shot, I mean you'd shoot once, and then you'd have to reload it. And this black powder wasn't really the best because it created a lot of smoke, and everyone knows that smoke can reduce visibility. And I couldn't fit all the weapons that the Imperial Army used, but they also used like smaller firearms. They even used Gatling guns that they imported. All of these guns, all of the weapons that they had were imported from other countries. They didn't start making their first guns until 1880, and even those weren't of good quality. So, who was Saigo Takamori, and what were the beliefs that sparked the rebellion? Saigo Takamori was a very popular government official who was influential on the decisions like going to war with Korea. And among the samurai, he was really popular because of his role when he was actively working in the samurai before he became a government official. And he came in, ended the Edo period, and and then after a while of being a government official, and I have to mention that he also opposed modernizing Japan in the construction of railroads, which is kind of interesting. But anyways, after a while, he retired from the government and opened samurai academies so he could teach people the way of the samurai. And there was increasing unrest among the samurai because of them having their social status stripped and now they didn't have any like source of income. And and he was so popular among the samurai that the government sent spies to make sure that he wasn't planning a rebellion because that would be really bad for the government if this really popular dude among the samurai opening samurai academies would cause a rebellion against this inexperienced army. So they sent spies, and the spies were captured by samurai, and they were tortured until they revealed their motives. And this really enraged the samurai. So they got together and banded together, and they got Takamori out of retirement because they wanted to quote unquote protect Saigo. So what was the Japanese honor code? The Japanese honor code was also known as Bushido, and it was basically the rules that samurai lived by. And it was to live an honest and virtuous life. And the rules were pretty simple, really. It was it was try I'm sorry for stuttering a little bit. It was being like loyal, polite, modest, not being greedy, and a big part of it was, well, it's in the name. The big part of it was honor, and a way of preserving one's honor was to not surrender whatsoever. And they would not a lot of them would not surrender by any means possible. So what they would do is that they would commit seppuku, or basically symbolic suicide. And what they do is that they get their blade and slice open their abdomen. and it was extremely painful, and oftentimes they'd get another samurai to chop off their head while they're in the peak of pain, as, like I said, symbolic. So the first battle of the Satsuma Rebellion was the siege of the Kumamoto Castle. And on February 19th, 1877, the first shots were fired. Now, the numbers were about 12,000 samurai against a little over 4,000 Imperial Army troops. I believe it was 4,400, if I'm not mistaken. And the thing that made this battle interesting was the heavy snow and ice that fell. It was like the biggest amount that had fallen in decades. Excuse me. And the Imperial Army were in a very dire situation because after a bunch of fighting, the rebels just decided to dig into the ice and starve out the Imperial Army. And they were low on supplies because earlier they suffered a warehouse fire that destroyed a lot of their food, ammunition, equipment, and and another big uh, portion of it was the conscript nature of the army. They'd hire they would hire peasants, people who weren't experienced with the military whatsoever. What they also got was a bunch of ex-samurai who were still loyal to Takamori. And after the fighting stopped at Kumamoto, um, I believe something crazy, like a crazy amount of samurai fled over not to Kumamoto, to Takamori's side. So you had this big change sides from the Imperial Army to the rebels, and uh that made Takamori's army a lot bigger, and it was really helpful. So next was the Battle of Tabaruzaka. And Tabaruzaka was basically the continuation of Kumamoto. And what Takamori did was he divided his troops to make a 6.5 mile wide defensive line, using about using about 15,000 out of the 20,000 troops that he had. However, he underestimated how much Imperial Army troops that they were, as they were facing heavy fighting against eventually 90,000 Imperial Army troops. I believe that's 6 to 1. That's a huge amount of like discrepancy between the two, and there's basically no way that the samurai were gonna really win. But after the battle ended, there were about 4,000 deaths and injuries on both sides. Now, a, now a cool thing about this was that a future Japanese prime minister uh, lost his hand in this battle, and and like I said, he'd become prime minister after the rebellion. So after Tabaruzaka, um, uh, both sides were really low in resources, and Takamori led a week-long march while pockets of samurai in the leaving pockets of samurai to attack unsuspecting Imperial Army soldiers. And the remaining 5,000 soldiers would be beaten and battered by numerous like attacks and battles. And to preserve their honor, they'd, like I said in an earlier slide, they'd commit seppuku or commit suicide. And um and by the end of this, Takamori's army was down to 3,000. So he was not doing too good. Now, the Battle of Shiroyama was the last battle of the Satsuma Rebellion. And retreating from Kumamoto, about 400 samurai and Takamori took Mount Shiroyama, which overlooked the city of Shiroyama, if I'm not mistaken. And the the Imperial Army heavily fortified this. Like there's a picture that I didn't put on here, but it's like the entrance to Shiroyama, and it's this big blockade wall. It's kind of insane, especially by 1877 standards. And and it was a famous 60-1 battle. And at 4 a.m. on September 24th, different groups of samurai charged down the hill and just tried to kill as many soldiers as they could because the Imperial Army was really experienced with rifles. They weren't experienced with close range fighting. And during this, um, during this, Takamori got shot in the hip and stomach, and there was no way he was surviving. So he committed suicide to preserve his honor, and then his second in command cut off his head and hid it so the enemy couldn't find it and used it as like a trophy. But hiding it is in relative terms, as well. It was really rushed. They found hair on the scene, and a low-wage worker. I can't say the name that it was called because people might get mad at me. Found it, and it was just a botched operation in general. So after so during Shiroyama, near like the end of Shiroyama battle, um, it was basically death. There's no other way to say it. It's called a last stand, but it was basically death. And Takamori's second in command, he charged down the hill without any communication, no ammo, just after Takamori died, charged down the hill. And the few remaining samurai were just like, I'm just gonna take as many people with me. So they drew their swords, charged down the hill, and then all of them got shot to death. And after the last one died, it marked the ending of the Satsuma Rebellion, yet it would still be an incredibly symbolic thing. Because, you had this samurai spirit going up against the Imperial Army in impossible to win numbers, but they did it anyways. And the aftermath slide. So the aftermath of the Satsuma Rebellion rocked isolationist Japan. It was 420 million yen, equivalent to just under $100 million in today's money. Now this is 420 million yen in 1877 standards. So it was a huge deal. I don't know how else to say it. And there were other economic effects, like almost tripling the national debt. They were lowering land taxes to from it was like 3% to 2.5%. Doesn't seem like much, but when you have all of these people with land in Japan, it's going to be a big loss. And by and once it was over, it was a shining example of how artillery, like the Gatling gun, just guns in general, were good against men with blades and swords. And about 20 years after the death of Takamori, he was pardoned by the future king, and that was basically like the last time the Satsuma Rebellion was mentioned in official stuff. And It really got popular again after movies like The Last Samurai. If I'm not mistaken, a power metal band m made a song called The Last Stand. I love you, Sabaton. Um, and it was basically just a huge amount of money just gone. The economy was destroyed. They finally got everything running once they started becoming a lot more expansionist, taking over Korea, tiny islands, all of that. Uh, Excuse me. And all in all, Satsuma Rebellion was an economically devastating event for Japan, and it caused radical changes. They had to start printing paper money. Um, they had to start opening trade with the West get get more influx of money so they could make the economy rebound. And it taught the world the effects of modern artillery and the adverse effects of what huge reforms in social classes and military classes do, because it can cause large amounts of dissatisfaction like it did with the samurai, and it could cause rebellion. Um, I don't remember if there's any other like rebellions or civil wars that happened because of it, but still, it's it's just a big example of how you have to pay attention to how certain classes react to something that directly affects them, if you know what I mean. Here's my sources. I'm sending in the bibliography, and that's the end of my presentation about the Satsuma Rebellion. Thank you if you've made it this far, and thank you for listening. I hope I've taught you something pretty neat, and um, yeah, that's about it. Thanks, thanks for watching.